Every single October, I am reminded of the fact that Michael Jackson just didn't know the difference between a horror and a thriller. Hello and welcome to The Book Thing. My name is Mark and this is my wrap up for everything that I read in October. October was a pretty good month, I have to say. So I read a couple of short stories and then about 8 full-size books as well. And as you'd probably expect for spooky season, there was a bit of a horror inflection to them as well. So a couple of 5-star reads in there. So let's get started. So the first book that I read in October was The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. And this was a buddy read with my friend Cliff over at Cliff Start Gems. And I have to say, I'm very, very glad that I read this book as a buddy read because honestly, it's not one I wanted to go into on my own. So this is a fictional retelling of a real life case, the murder of Sylvia Likens, which happened in the early 60s, I think. In the real case, Sylvia Likens was a teenage girl who, with her disabled sister, went to live with this woman and another family, and within a month had been killed. And she had been, over the course of that month, had suffered through an incredible amount of abuse and torture, quite frankly. So The Girl Next Door is a fictional retelling, is from the perspective of a young boy called David, who lives next door to the Chandler family, which is Ruth and her 3 sons. And after the death of their parents, Ruth takes in her 2 nieces, Meg and Susan. Meg is the older girl and Susan is the younger girl who, after having polio as a younger child, has to wear leg braces and is disabled as a result. And as time starts to go on, the treatment of Meg starts to become crueler and more callous, and less of it is from Ruth, more of it is from her 3 sons and some of the other neighborhood children. And Ruth is this ringleader and authority figure for these children and is directing them to inflict greater levels of cruelty onto Meg. And it's a pretty disturbing read because David is not someone who inflicts any of the cruelty, but is there as a witness and doesn't do anything to stop the cruelty. And because it's written in the first person, it draws you in as a reader to being complicit and another bystander who's not doing anything to help. I had a lot of reservations about going into this because of the nature of what the story is about and because it is based on a real live crime as well. My concerns were that it was going to be exploitative of the real life case. I don't think it is, but my other concern was that it was going to be violence and cruelty that was going to be hard to take, and that it most certainly was. And as a result, I'm very, very glad that I read this with Cliff and this was a buddy read and we could support each other on this. I gave this book 4 stars, but I don't recommend anyone to read this necessarily. This has all of the trigger warnings associated with it. I would suggest, normally I try to steer clear of spoilers with books and I always try to go in blind with things, but this is one of these books where I really think you need to go in with your eyes open and understand what it is you're likely to be reading because it's bound to upset most people. I have rating criteria that I use when I'm coming up with my star ratings for my book, so I'll look at various different things like the characters, how well it's written, the themes and all of that sort of thing in a book, and then use that to come up with my overall star rating. And it scored very, very highly in just about all of the areas with the exception of overall enjoyment, because I can't say that I enjoyed this book. I'm very glad I read it. It was a difficult read and a worthwhile read, but I can't say that at any point I was actively enjoying it. So it was a 4-star read for me, but I don't recommend it to anyone to read. If it does sound interesting and intriguing, please read up on it before you go in, because It's a lot. So after The Girl Next Door, I wanted something a bit lighter and easier to get through, and I got that with Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession. So this actually was a recommendation from Pat at Book Chat with Pat, which she said she'd read it and then almost straight away read it a second time, which is very, very high praise. And this is by an Irish author, and it's about the two protagonists of the story, Leonard and Hungry Paul. Leonard and Hungry Paul as characters have been described by the author as quiet people, and I think that's a very apt description of them. At the start of the story, we're introduced to them both, and Leonard is in his 30s, living with his mother. His father died before he was born, I think. And Hungry Paul is living at home with his parents of a similar age as well. And these are two characters who are not exactly open to change in their lives. They like for their lives to be quiet and uneventful. But at the beginning of this story, Leonard's mother dies, and Hungry Paul's sister is getting married. So there are external things happening that is causing changes in their lives. If you're looking for high-octane action, melodramatic events and interactions, you're not going to get it in this. This is just about two gentle souls trying to get on with their lives as best they can. It's very, very enjoyable. It's got a lovely wit to it, but without any cynicism. I gave it 5 stars, and a big thank you to Pat for recommending this one to me. Next, we start to get into the meat of spooky season with Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. This is the first of a couple of ghost stories that I read this month, some of which were rereads of books that I'd read previously, and some of them were new to me. Dark Matter was one that was new to me, but I talked about the ghost stories I was reading in a bit more detail when I did my top 10 ghost stories for spooky season. I'll put the link to that video on the description down below. But Dark Matter is, I suppose you could probably describe it as a gothic horror. We're not got any large isolated mansions in this one, but it is very, very isolated. It's told through the memoirs of a character called Jack Miller. It's set in the 1930s, and it's about an expedition up to the Arctic Circle, to the islands of Spitsbergen, or Svalbard as they're now known. The plan is to take up residency in this abandoned mining facility that is above the Arctic Circle, where they're going to spend an entire year, which includes the winter of being exclusively dark all of the time. Initially, locals are trying to dissuade them from going there, but it wouldn't be a proper gothic novel if they didn't ignore the advice of the locals. And when they arrive at the facility and start to settle in, there are starting to be some ghostly happenings and goings on. So it has all the trappings of a real gothic ghost story, the likes of The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. But by taking this gothic ghost story and then placing the action north of the Arctic Circle, where it's almost perpetual night, you get this massive increase to the sense of isolation that's there. This is like the unholy union between The Woman in Black and John Carpenter's The Thing. It is really creepy and scary, very, very effective. I absolutely loved it. It was a 5-star read from me, and if you want a good ghost story, you can't do much better than Dark Matter. The next book I read, which I don't have a physical copy of, is a haunted house story without a ghost in it. And that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So this is the story of the Blackwood family who live in this large manor house outside of this community in New England somewhere. And the Blackwood family, or what's left of the Blackwood family, which is Merricat and Constance and Uncle Julian. So We Have Always Lived in the Castle is told from the perspective of Merricat Blackwood, who lives with her sister Constance and her uncle Julian in a large manor house outside of a small New England town. And the Blackwood family are pariahs to that whole community. And this is down to the rest of the Blackwood family having been poisoned and killed some years earlier. Constance got the blame for that. She was arrested and tried, but ultimately acquitted, but the town doesn't forget and still blame Constance and ultimately shun the remaining family left behind. So the three Blackwoods have this very mundane and very routine life until their cousin Charles arrives, who has arrived after the death of his father. It seems that Charles has very much an interest in the wealth of the family that's left behind, and Constance takes a liking to him, Mary Cat does not, and then this starts to cause a level of turmoil with the family, and then also that starts to spill over into the town as well. This is kind of an origin story of a haunted house. It's like, how did Boo Radley become Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird? The events that grow into the legend that creep up around a house becoming isolated, its inhabitants being isolated, and there being a sense of mystery and unease and horror to it. This is my second Shirley Jackson book. I'd read The Haunting of Hill House, but I hadn't really liked it that much. But We Have Always Lived in the Castle came very highly recommended, so I gave it a go. And I have to say I'm glad I did, because I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I said, this is like a ghost story that doesn't have a ghost in it. It's like origin story for a haunted house. I loved how it was set out. I liked that certain things which another author might have put in as a twist, Shirley Jackson didn't. She just let it be kind of an assumed thing, and that the revelations weren't like a big twist and the thing that the whole story hinged on. I gave it 4.5 stars. I thought it was really clever, really enjoyable, great characters, fantastically well painted, and just seeing the escalation of how things happened at the end. Yeah, it was a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. The next ghost story I read was The Old Nurse's Story, a short story by Elizabeth Gaskell. And to my shame, this is the first thing of Elizabeth Gaskell's that I've read. And this was a pretty much textbook Victorian ghost story. As the title implied, the nurse is telling a story to her young charges about a time when she was a younger nursemaid to their mother. After the death of the young girl's parents, they go to live with relatives in an old house out in the country, and then there starts to be some ghostly goings on with a little ghostly child knocking on the window. It's a properly effective ghost story. It's got all of the hallmarks that you'd expect, a sin from the past that people are trying to put right and all of this sort of stuff. I really enjoyed it. It's very, very short. You can get through it very quickly. It was a nice 3.5 star read for me and well worth a read. Next up from my ghost stories list, I had a couple of rereads, and the first of those was Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. Joe Hill, of course, being the son of Stephen King. And as a son of Stephen King, you'd expect him to be writing scary stuff, and he is. So Heart-Shaped Box is about an aging rocker called Judas Coyne who goes and buys a ghost off the internet. He sees an auction on the internet where someone is claiming to be selling a suit that has an old ghost attached to it. The suit duly arrives in a heart-shaped box, and Jude starts to realize that not only was there a ghost actually attached to it, but in actual fact, he was destined to be the one to receive said ghost, and that ghost wishes him a lot of harm. It's a very creepy story. The characterization is fantastic. The main character of Jude is, I'd say, morally questionable, and as a result, you're trying to figure out as time goes on whether or not he does actually deserve the haunting that he's been inflicted upon him. And there's plenty of twists and turns to keep you guessing as to where it's going and what's happening in it. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a good yarn, told well. I gave it 4 stars, and if you're looking for a good ghost story, then pick up Heart-Shaped Box. The other reread for me is a book called Haunted by James Herbert. Are we starting to see a theme in these books I chose this month? So Haunted is the first of 3 books about a character called David Ash, who is this investigator of paranormal experiences. So he goes and he investigates hauntings and all of these strange occurrences. And David is very much a cynic. He doesn't believe that any of it is real, and he goes in with the mindset that he is going to prove that everything has a rational explanation. The institute that he works for is approached, and they ask for David to come and investigate the occurrences at a house called Edbrook. So, you know, trope-wise, you've got an old manor house out in the middle of the English countryside, you know, isolation, all of that sort of thing that you'd expect. And David gets there, and as you'd expect, he is starting to see that maybe there's some things going on that can't be really explained. And some of that is down to the behavior of the people who live in the house. And David is starting to get the impression that he's being set up and pranked. This is one of James Herbert's earlier books, but it's still a nice, fresh twist on the haunted house story, where it takes all of the tropes and then subverts the expectations just a little bit. It's a great yarn. It's well worth a read. It's another 3.5-star read from me. And yeah, if you've never picked up any James Herbert book, Haunted's not a bad place to start. The next thing I read was another short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is, again, like I said, a short story, and it is from the perspective of this unnamed woman protagonist who has clearly had some sort of nervous breakdown, and she's living in this house that her husband has rented for a summer season. And her husband is a physician, and he has decided the best way for her to recuperate from this illness that she had is to keep her isolated in this one nursery room at the top of the house. And he prevents her from reading and writing and leaving the room and everything like that. And the only thing that she has to focus on is some particularly ugly yellow wallpaper. This story really packs a punch, and it can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. You could take it on face value from our narrator's perspective, and that actually there are supernatural elements to this yellow wallpaper. But the more likely explanation is that we're witnessing this slow descent into madness, which has largely come about due to the patronizing and controlling behavior of her husband. I gave this 4.5 stars. This was a really poignant and creepy story, and considering it was written in the 1890s, was a very, very strong feminist story as well. Next up, I've got my non-fiction book of the month, and that was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. So this was the selection of my book club at work, and it was intended to coincide with what is in the UK Black History Month, which is October. And I'm very glad the book club did choose it, because otherwise I might not have picked this up, because I'm not the world's biggest fan of autobiographies. I find that most autobiographies are very episodic and generally fall into the trap of just, you know, a linear series of anecdotes matter-of-factly told. But with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, you can tell that Maya Angelou was a poet, because this is first and foremost a beautiful piece of writing, and then secondly, it's one of her autobiographies. I think she's got like 7 or 8, but this is the one that takes her from like 3 years of age up to the age of 17. So in the 1930s, Maya Angelou was 3 years of age, at which point she went to live with her father's mother along with her older brother in this small southern town of Stamps, Arkansas, which is very much still in an era of segregation and casual racial violence. We explore an awful lot about her life, and we see her connections with her community, but also some of the horrors that go on in that community as well. It's very, very engaging. It is at times very, very funny, but it is at times extraordinarily harrowing. And I would absolutely check any potential trigger warnings in this, because there is some episodes especially one when she was just 8 years of age, which is just horrific to have to read through. There are a couple of things as a reader that can be frustrating. So there are some events in her life, like a particular graduation day where she will dwell for a significant period of time on, whereas other events, it'll be given a very, very short description. It'll be like, and then that was the time I ran away and lived in a junkyard for a month. And you're like, wait, what? Another thing about this book is this book has been named as the one that has been most often challenged and removed from libraries in the US. It's certainly not for younger readers, but I think it's a far too important book to be removed from schools and libraries. I gave it 4 stars. I don't know if I'm going to read any more of her autobiographies. As I said, I'm not a huge autobiography fan, but I'm very glad I read this one. And my final book of the month was The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. So this is the first part of his latest series, and it is set in an alternate version of medieval Europe. So it's not set in a purely fantastical world. It is set in a recognizable medieval Europe. You know, there are places that we would recognize to this day, but it's a very different medieval Europe. Magic is very real. Magical and supernatural creatures are very real. Large swathes of Eastern Europe are all controlled by the vicious elf race. And the Pope is a 10-year-old girl leading an increasingly militant church. And the Devils of the title is the nickname for the Church of Holy Expediency, which is under the direct control of the Pope and are given various different tasks to do. They are mostly made up of a group of dangerous supernatural beings, and their particular task on this occasion is to take the newly recognized Princess Alexei from the Holy City all the way out to the city of Troy, where she's to be installed as the Empress. So it's this kind of Dirty Dozen Suicide Squad dynamic made up of, you know, vampires and werewolves and all of that sort of thing. Now, I loved Joe Abercrombie's first Law trilogy, so I went into this with high hopes. Now, if this book had come out in 1995, 2000, you know, an era where, you know, films were being all edgy. You know, you've got films out like Man Bites Dog and Kevin Smith is doing Dogma. We're approaching the time Buffy the Vampire Slayer is going to be on our TV screens, and Quentin Tarantino's at the height of his popularity with his bloody violence and wisecracks and all of that sort of thing. If this book had come out then, when I was like late teens, early 20s, this would probably be my favourite book. But it's not 1995, it's 2025, and I'm a lot closer to 50 than I am to 20. So the constant bloody violence and swearing and wisecracks got really quite tiresome for me after quite a short period of time. I think Joe Abercrombie is generally fantastic at doing characters and character development, and I saw little to none of that in here. Every single line of dialogue feels like either a setup or a punchline. There is no time for any character development because it's just relentless fighting and action scenes done as bloodily and as swearily as possible. And it really felt quite juvenile, if I'm going to be completely honest. So yeah, 2.5 stars. It was a bit of a disappointment, and to me, The Devils is like a pizza cutter. It's all edge and no point. So anyway, that was my October. How about you? How were your spooky season reads? Let me know in the comments down below. In the meantime, thanks a million for watching this. Really appreciate you taking the time to do that, and take care.